Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Bateman. Thank you, Professor Fung, for being here. Now, Mr. Bateman, you had intimated at the outset of your remarks that you may not be as overly familiar with the situation here, but I want to just elaborate on a few of your principles that you spoke about. Now, you spoke about supply and demand when it comes to foreign interference or disinformation, and also the fact that it is politicians who are most often the sources of misinformation, disinformation. Would you agree as well that politicians actually not only are critical when it comes to what they put out, but also in their function when they are in a security capacity and a capacity of ensuring that disinformation doesn't get out? In other words, politicians, government plays a protective role. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would.
And part of that protective role is that when government sees things going awry, things going sideways, and they see misinformation and disinformation occurring, that government actually has an obligation to act. I take it you'd agree with that as well?
Well, it depends on the nature of the action being contemplated, because some actions can be helpful and others can be counterproductive.
Okay. So what I'm saying is that when misinformation and disinformation are occurring, the government can conceivably do nothing, but to do nothing is to allow this to occur even more. Isn't that right?
To some extent, but typically a lot of information is transmitted through society without the government taking any particular action. In the case of foreign influence activities, there's a lot more the government can do. But whether or not to publicly disclose such activity or take technical measures or diplomatic measures against the country at issue is often a complicated calculation.
Well, it certainly is a complicated calculation, but I think you'd agree that shining the light on foreign interference in some way is always the best antidote to address foreign interference, is it not?
It often is. The exception to that principle is that sometimes the foreign actor may anticipate and even desire or benefit from the public disclosure of their operation. For example, if Russia is conducting an influence operation that is publicly exposed, and then that public exposure actually creates a lot more societal anxiety and fear and distrust than the initial influence operation itself, that could be considered a win for Russia. So that's one of the complications that government needs to consider.
I see what you're saying. They're sowing chaos and they're getting their desired results. Now, when it comes to elected officials, generally, I think it's in everybody's best interest to know whether their elected officials, the people that they're putting an X beside when it comes to elections, have been willingly or semi-willingly participating in foreign interference. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
So in such cases, transparency is paramount. If the government is aware that elected officials are participating in foreign interference willingly, the best thing that can be done is to address those things publicly, is it not?
That would require a framework of law and, again, careful consideration. For example, I'm a former U.S. intelligence analyst, and so I'm familiar with the possibility that there could be unverified intelligence information about someone being co-opted or roped into foreign disinformation, but that might not be a legal certainty.
Right. So, sorry, and I don't mean to cut you off, but I'm just going to ask you to operate on the assumption that we have intelligence services in Canada that have verified and they have come to conclusions. And the conclusions are that 11 parliamentarians have, or either wittingly or semi-wittingly, acting with foreign and hostile states. This intelligence has been verified. It went into a report. In that case there, people in Canada are being expected to vote in the next 12 to 13 months, in all likelihood, on these people. Does it not make sense for democracy, for the integrity of the system, and for foreign interference to be stymied at its root, to expose this and shine the light on it? Does that not make a ton of sense?
Without commenting on the Canadian situation, because I don't know the details, I would just say there are situations where an intelligence assessment might fall short of a prosecutable offense, and that would then create a judgment call and a difficult decision. But I'm not familiar with the Canadian specifics.
Well, could there be any worse discord? You know, you talked about the Russia example. Is there anything worse, any worse discord than people questioning whether who they're voting for is compromised by a hostile state?
I do think one of the reasons that public disclosure can be helpful is when the lack of disclosure creates an environment in which selective leaks and rumors are running rampant. We saw this in previous U.S. elections, and that did seem to lead to a policy of greater disclosure, but not universal disclosure. Each disclosure needs to be taken on its own terms.
Thank you.
Mr. Fung, given what we know about the disinformation campaigns targeting our elections, and particularly by the campaign perpetrated by the communist dictatorship in Beijing against former Conservative Member of Parliament Kenny Chiu, the current Liberal government has failed to adequately address this, and this is, borne out by the fact that we have to have a commission to look into foreign interference, and that the legislation that's been put forward has not come in the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh years of their mandate. What should government be doing today to prevent hostile foreign state actors like the communist dictatorship in Beijing, from putting their thumb on the scale of Canadian democracy?
So my first recommendation is to set up, there are two different ways. One way is to set up a government agencies like the U.S. model, like the Global Engagement Center, that will give them the authority to monitor the social media posts that are related to the democratic process. So they have the technological capability and the legal authority to stop some of this disinformation. Another approach is to create a not-for-profit organization, and then give that organization the authority to do a similar process, but more independent from the government. Yeah.
Can you provide some examples for anyone who's not familiar, and for the purpose of our report, of the type of actions that the CCP, the communist dictatorship in Beijing, has used to try and influence our elections, and if you have another example of a countermeasure that could be applied to that example that you provide?
Okay. So one of the example, for example, is they are not just focusing on the social media disinformation. When we talk about disinformation, we often talk about the social media. But for the CCP, they are not just focusing on social media. They also work with traditional media, which is the Chinese media running in Canada. And they are newspaper, they are radio stations in Vancouver and Toronto. And they are collaborating with the CCP, different Chinese organizations running in Canada. So, and one of the questions raised previously, what's the difference between Russians and this disinformation and Chinese disinformation here, is the economic power in here, because they can use the advertisement to indirectly control the radio station and newspaper on what they put on their contents. How do they invite different commentators to the radio stations? So they can use the local economic power to control that, which is not the same in the Russian case. So to fight against this type of collaboration, I think the C-70 will play part of the role, which is trying to identify the foreign agent in this case. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Mr. Bateman, you're someone who has experience assessing a foreign state's senior leadership and cybersecurity. Are you able to identify any systems or countermeasures that the current government could have put in place to this point, or could now quickly put in place to protect us from malicious state actors, to protect our national security, our economy, to protect our democracy?
I'm not specifically familiar with gaps within the Canadian system, but I can offer some best practices from other systems. So there are a variety of tools that are available to governments to fight foreign interference. One of them is naming and shaming, sanctions, indictments. Another is targeted technical actions, such as cyber operations that could be carried out to disrupt the foreign activity, especially during a temporary sensitive period, such as before or after an election. And there are others as well, like Professor Fung mentioned, simply public disclosure and public information. And so one path would be to build capacity in each of those areas. But another path would be to build connectivity across these areas and make sure that they're working together, which is something the U.S. government has done. I will say that in the end, it's not clear how effective any of these policies are. We've been naming and shaming and indicting and sanctioning and disrupting these adversaries for some time, and it probably has some operational impact on them, but it doesn't stop the activity.
Okay, thanks. Response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Fung, one of the tools that this government set up supposedly to counter foreign interference and foreign disinformation during elections was the directive on the critical election incident public protocol. Are you familiar with that protocol?
I'm not familiar with that protocol.
You're not familiar with it. Needless to say, it provided that candidates who are the target of disinformation ought to be informed, barring national security considerations. Now, my former colleague, Kenny Chu, was drowning in a sea of disinformation in Steveston, Richmond East, and he wasn't alone in that regard. Several other Conservative candidates were, including former Member of Parliament Alice Wong. Mr. Chu was kept in the dark in the face of disinformation, but Madam Justice Hogue concluded there was a reasonable possibility that those narratives from the Beijing regime impacted the result in that riding. Now, you spoke about the PRC and the connections between the PRC and certain media within Canada. And I would note in that regard that at page 17 of the NSICOP report, the NSICOP noted that, quote, most of these media outlets in the GVA, in the Greater Vancouver area, were linked to the PRC via partnership agreements with the Chinese News Service, the Chinese Communist Party's primary media entity. So here you not only have foreign disinformation from Beijing amplified on social media platforms, including WeChat, but you actually have news outlets that are amplifying that disinformation that are Canadian-owned. So can you speak to that and some of the methods that the Chinese regime is using and how that can be countered, because it certainly was something that may have impacted the result in more than one riding.
So let's say for the Kenny Chu's case, right? So it was first started in WeChat and WhatsApp. A piece of this disinformation appeared on the social media, and then it was spread on the mainly on the Chinese social media platform. And then the next day, there's a Chinese propaganda newspaper, Today Commercial News, try to basically copy-paste that message from the WeChat and then amplify it on the propaganda machines. And then after that, many other Chinese news articles was written on different Chinese websites, and then it feed back to the social media. And then on the radio stations and newspaper in Vancouver area, they also try to have basically invite some biased commentators on the radio stations to amplify this again. So this is not just on the media, because they are indirectly controlled by the advertisement from the Chinese merchant in that area. So, and then when they try to, let's say, when some of the organizations try to organize an event, they will invite the Chinese consulate to attend those events, and then they will put those Chinese consulates at a higher position as a VVIP than the MP in Canada. So if you are an attendee of that meeting, you will know that who is the real boss in there and who is the one who can make decision is the Chinese consulate. So this message passed to the Chinese merchant in Richmond or in the Vancouver area, and then it will affect the media in the area.
Well, thank you for that. And it has been noted the role that Beijing-based consular officials played in directing disinformation and interfering in the 2021 election as well as the 2019 election. And notwithstanding that evidence, it must be noted that this Liberal government has done absolutely nothing to hold those consular officials accountable who interfered in our elections and attacked our democracy to the benefit of the Liberal Party. Now, I do want to ask you, Mr. Fung, you talked about the need for transparency. And indeed, that is consistent with what CSIS has recommended, that sunshine is the best disinfectant. But there are challenges with that, particularly in diaspora communities. Do you have any recommendations on how disinformation of the kind that was going on in the 2021 election in Chinese diaspora communities can be effectively countered, because there are unique challenges in that regard in getting to people to make them aware of that disinformation.
We're way over time. I'm going to ask Mr. Fung to respond to that question in writing. I will have the clerk follow up with you, sir, exactly what Mr. Cooper was asking for, and if you could follow that up in writing, I would appreciate that so we can move on, okay? Thank you.